So, Jacques, thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
I'm delighted to have a chance to speak with you.
Thank you. Now, my first question is, please could you tell me the significance of the title Scattered Castles?
Well, scattered castles is a name used in the classified setting. The name itself is not classified, otherwise, I couldn't put it on the cover. But it's where if you have a clearance, a security clearance, and you need to access a particular program in a particular way, this is the repository that you would go to find out the details of how you would access different programs. So it's used, throughout the government for access to different documents and so on. So I thought that research on UFOs is also a number of castles that are scattered, both within the DoD and then in the intelligence community, and then outside of the US, to different countries. And France has two official programs and different people compiling files and doing research and so on. So it's very much a scattered world. And I thought that would be something people would remember. It's not a common name.
Yes, it certainly stands out. Now, you write in the book about working with a classified project that ultimately disappointed you. Can you expand on that?
Well, I'm not sure that very much needs to be classified, and both in some things have to be protected. For example, the medical records of witnesses. Very often, witnesses are traumatized. They may be under, under study or under care of a physician and so on. Those records are supposed to be protected, just in a civil society, but also within, if it involves something like, UFO reports, it should be preserved. So I don't have any problem with that. There are other situations where I remember working with Dr. Hynek, the newspapers and journalists always say the classified Air Force files. Well, the Air Force files, back in the 60s, 70s, were never classified. Any scientist could have asked to have access to them, and they would have been delighted to be able to bring in scientists who could explain some of the things that the Air Force wasn't really specialized in. I remember, going with Dr. Hynek at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base with my French passport. In those days, I wasn't an American yet. You had to wait 5 years before you could be naturalized. But I had a clearance for 3 days, and we went there. So, on the studies that have been done recently, including, the one I was associated with Mr. Bigelow and Colm Keller and my friends, the study was classified, and to a large extent, it still is. And I don't think scientifically there is any reason why that should continue to be classified. In the area that I was involved in was, the database itself, and or the data warehouse. We started with 10 different files, different catalogs, including pilot catalogs and so on. And and then that was extended in a classified setting. So it remains classified today, but eventually most of that should be turned over to the scientific community. It needs to be. It's fairly easy to sanitize it. And I remember when I was working with Dr. Hynek, I would see, a list of sightings, and a few of them had a little star, and I would say, "What's the asterisk for?" And he would say, "Well, no, that one you can't see because it's classified." And I would say, "Well, why is it classified?" And he would look at it and he would laugh, and then he would tell me what it was. And it's somebody in Japan has seen something in the sky that was going in a particular direction, and it was just a light. And this is a civilian report. This lady saw a light. Well, why is it classified? Well, the light was at high altitude when it was reflecting the sun. The ground was in the evening in the shadows, but there was the high altitude was still illuminated by the not night completely, and that object happened to be going in a particular direction where it probably shouldn't have gone, which was the Soviet Union, and those were U-2s. So, of course, those special files there was a reason why it was classified. It wasn't a UFO, and practically all of the classified cases had to do with something like that. But I would tell I would see those things coming out of the the device, page after page after page, saying to White House, Joint Chiefs of Staff, NSA, CIA, and so on, Mrs. So-and-so has seen a light. And I would say, why does the White House need to know that this lady on the other side of the globe has seen a light in the sky? Well, the guy operating the teletype, it's 3:00 in the morning in Japan. He's a ordinary, military guy. He's 19. He doesn't know where that goes. The teletype is a special teletype that goes to all those places. So that all of a sudden it looks very fancy. It looks something like really important. The White House needs to know Mrs. Brown saw a light in the sky and she couldn't tell what it was. So after a while, yes, it's comical, but there are cases where it needs to be protected, and I understand that. So I cannot talk too much about the databases. The structure has been published by my friends and colleagues, in the project and so on. There is no great secrecy to that. The problem is that the project was stopped after only 2 years, and it was going to be a 5-year program. So I had designed an artificial intelligence layer that we were ready to, to put on top of the data, to refine the data, and then restrict the database. We had 260,000 cases. You don't need that many cases to show scientists. If you can show them, 15,000 well-documented UFO cases, that's going to keep them occupied for a while. And that was my goal in designing the database.
Are you aware that ORSAP, they tried to bring in the Department of Homeland Security and start this new project called Kona Blue? and it's been alleged that they were Robert Bigelow and Bass were to take control of certain materials from an aerospace contractor. Were you aware of that at the time?
Um, OSAP, I never thought about the project when I was working on it as being part of OSAP. OSAP was Washington, and as you know, there are names that were just temporary names that did not really mean that there was any structure behind the name. But so there was a lot of that. I really wasn't concerned with the politics or with the ties to, what else was going on in the Pentagon. To me, the project was vast, Bigelow Aerospace, and we had to work with the data that we were given. And the problem was, how can we extract information from the data that would, number one, clarify for the DoD, but also more largely for the scientific community, what was unique about the patterns of some of those objects or some of those vehicles. But beyond that, there was something else. We were hoping to get to the point where we could better, analyze the physical characteristics and also the impact on people, including the medical impact, but also the visual and beyond that, even the parapsychology impact. We know that witnesses have recurrent dreams after that. We know that some of them, like Whitley Strieber, report encounters with. There were people within our team, who had that experience. Okay? They were both visual witnesses, and they also had been exposed to things on the ground. Sometimes had been harmed by that. So we were hoping to be able to get into those aspects of that, and the database was constructed in such a way that we could gather that information. Very often, in the past, when I was working with groups like MUFON or others, all that was an afterthought. Oh, by the way, this lady was blind in one eye for 2 days. After the. Well, we were very careful to capture all of that within the entire structure. And then, of course, the problem was to begin to do research on that. The fact that the study was classified prevented us from having a lot of communication within the team itself. Okay, so we had high clearances, but we had high clearances for specific technical aspects. Okay, I even had a clearance that would have allowed me to go through customs with something without being interrogated about what it was. Okay, there were two of us who had that special clearance. It's called a courier clearance. So I could come back from Argentina with a biological sample, well protected, and the customs people would let me go. Okay. We never had occasion to use that, but this was well designed. This was well anticipated. The problem was that as we got into the research, there were people doing research, for example, on the medical aspects, who would have needed more that I had, but I didn't know what they were specifically working on at that point because I wasn't cleared for the medical aspects. I didn't need I didn't have the need to know for that. I had the top secret clearance, but I didn't have the need to know about medical subjects. So, in an open structure, everybody would be working together in the university, for example, and over lunch you would talk about what happened this morning, and I would say, by the way, there is a new case with medical things. Do you have anything about that in the file that would correlate with that? And I could say, yes, we've got 15 cases like that, but they never knew. Okay, so at the end of the project, we compared notes, and this was one of the constraints. You understand why it has to be that way if people are designing rockets or uh, weapons or things like that, because there are a number of technologies. But when you're doing open research, you can't do that. It gets in the way.
Now, you mentioned in the book, you discuss some independent investigations in Brazil, Argentina, Europe, and Russia. What were the most compelling findings?
Um, I think well, in Argentina, I revisited a case that I had seen over 35 years before. So the witness was a kid. And when I first met him, I met his parents. I went to the site, and we assembled a number of things, and I had the file. And then, I get a message from a very gifted movie director in Argentina who says, I'm going to go over some UFO, from a poetic, point of view and so on. And I understand you went to that particular place. And I asked him, how much do you know about this witness? And he said, I've, met him, and it's very charming. It's very interesting. He was a kid. And I tell him, why don't I send you the file? And then I said, you know, um, why don't you let me fly back to Argentina and continue the research, because very, very few cases have been reinvestigated 35 years later, okay, where the environment has changed, some things have remained the same, but now, this witness is not a 14-year-old boy, he's a man, and with all his experiences of the environment and everything else. And the question is, how much does he remember? How has it impacted his life? So that was fascinating, and so that movie is out now and has been very well received. I asked him for 6 months before I went there so I could relearn Spanish. I was fluent in Spanish when I was a kid, and having gone to Spain several times. But, that had evaporated, and I wanted to be able to speak to him in his own language without an interpreter. I do those kinds of things without. I do have a camera in my pocket to use eventually, but I don't take a tape recorder. I take a pen and a piece of paper to take notes, but I don't want anything breaking the conversation with the witness, because we're going to talk about things that, may be painful. We may be talking about things that are just coming back to his or her memory. And I want to be able to capture that, to preserve it, and to work with it. We're going to be together for several days, not just half an hour, good morning, ma'am, tell me about the light you saw. That's not the idea. So I think the most important thing was, other than Argentina, was in Brazil, because there had been, investigations in Brazil, including investigations from our program, from BAS, from OSAP. And I had not been part of that because I was busy with the computer side. And they came back with valuable information, but it didn't seem to correspond to what I knew about some of the places I went to, where I had gone myself before. So I thought, things change, witnesses change, new things happen, the phenomenon evolves. So if it evolves, it's very important to notice that. And so we have to go back to those places several times. But when I went there, I went there with two Americans who had experience in Brazil. One was an architect. He had actually built schools and hospitals and so on in Brazil under a joint program between the U.S. and Brazil, to help in Brazilian architecture and so on. He had learned with Frank Lloyd Wright. He was a student of American architecture, and spoke fluently. Had married a Brazilian woman, and so on. Understood the culture very well. The cultures, because there isn't one culture in Brazil. There are 3 or 4 cultures that play at the same time at the same place. And if you're like me and you're just coming from California, France has maybe a couple of cultures, but it doesn't have 4 cultures at the same time. So you need to know that. You need to know where you are and with whom. Otherwise, you make big, big, big mistakes. And I thought that we, as a project, had made huge mistakes in Brazil. And I rediscovered some sites where I had been. I re-investigated some cases from where I had been before. And then one of the things I wanted to know was, people talk about witnesses being killed. And that I don't know of any case like that in France. There are several rumored cases in the US where people were not just hurt, but killed, or at least died as a result of exposure. The question has always been, was there a motivation behind the harm to the people, or was it just a casual accident? So I wanted to revisit that in Brazil. And in fact, I investigated a couple of very striking medical cases that had not been known in the US at all before. And they are in the book.
Yes, and just sticking with Latin America, in the book you mention a document confirming that the CIA simulated UFO abductions as psychological warfare experiments. Could you tell us about that?
So this is one of my correspondents who wrote to me about that. And he was not a casual researcher. He was a real scientific researcher of cases, and especially contact cases. And he had investigated a number of cases where he believed that there had been a sort of a sociological project to assess certain aspects of the society. We know that had happened before in other circumstances, not with UFOs, but with drugs. And the question was, supposedly those projects were terminated because of, they had caused scandals all over the world. The question was to what extent. Now, I wasn't doing a political investigation, but my reputation was attached to the research at the site. And I didn't want to be fooled by a project like that, which was a psychological warfare project, you know. And well, to give you an example that's more simple, uh, airfields and depots of ammunition and so on are protected, of course, and they are guarded night and day by people with machine guns. Well, how good are these people at noticing things? Well, obviously they are trained, obviously they are tested, obviously all that, within the base, they do that very well. What if they saw something approaching that they couldn't recognize? That wasn't an airplane, didn't make any noise, looked like the Virgin Mary. You have a guy there who is a Catholic with a machine gun. What does he do? He's supposed to warn, and he's supposed to be in a defense position, and eventually he's supposed to shoot at something that's intruding over the fence. What is he going to do? Okay. So people laugh when you say that. Well, in World War One, the Germans knew that many of the French soldiers were Catholics, and they would try to impress them or demoralize them by projecting a photograph, an image in those days, 1915, 1916, an image of the Virgin Mary on the clouds over the French lines. Okay, this is a historic fact. Okay, obviously, tricks like that have been used again and again and again to make people believe that there was an attack in one area when you were going to attack in a different area and so on. So those are, of course, camouflage and different tricks that are used on the battlefield. But why would it be used with UFOs? Well, UFOs are an ideal way to hide something else, because you're surprised. You have a witness who is surprised, doesn't know what he's supposed to do next, because it's not in the instructions he got. The question was, with some of those sites, could, under these guise, could a very fancy helicopter take over a nuclear ammunition depot, by essentially preventing the guards from shooting. You just need 5 minutes to take over, to go over the fence and kill the guard, by the way. But so you need to know those things in very special situations, and I think that in going back, I thought we had been very naive the first couple of times we went into those situations. Brazil is a very complex culture, with several layers of religious beliefs, with several layers of parapsychology, and at every level, including the military. And I had the privilege of, many years before, of visiting one of the bases. They actually invited us. It took me a while to understand why. They knew we were there. Intelligence is very, very, very good in Brazil. Okay. Brazilian military intelligence is very good. You can't just sneak in. They know who you are and why you're there, and who you're asking questions to. So they knew we were there. We were not hiding. We were talking to civilians and so on. and they invited us to spend a day at the Primero Comar, which was one of the large areas over the Amazon. And we were there with Brazilian interpreters and Brazilian researchers, and then with my American friend and my wife. And this was certainly a day I'll never forget. The man in charge had been one of the people in charge of the task force on the edge of the Amazon and in the islands of the Amazon when there was a 3-month wave of UFOs over the entire zone. And people have tried to explain it by, oh, yes, those were decoys. Yes, they were working with the Americans to look at prototypes. Those were not prototypes. There is no prototype of something that looks like, two 747s emerging from the waters of the Amazon, in full light in the middle of the night. When there is nothing, there is no light, there is no, just a military camp there. Everybody else had fled, and that thing hovering, in full view, being photographed by the the Brazilians. Okay, I've seen those photographs. I wasn't supposed to see the photographs, and now some of the photographs have been, have been published and so on, but not the best ones. Now, they didn't show me that on the base. They let us look at. They told us, look, we've written 3 reports from those 3 months. We were tracking every night all those lights, all these objects. We were also looking at the injuries from people who had been close to the objects when they came during the day, when they came close to people. We've interviewed doctors who have seen all that. Okay, we re-interviewed the doctors. Okay? But they said you can't make notes, you can't take pictures of it, but they left us with the level 1 report. Level 2 and level 3, they didn't have, those had been taken back to Brasilia, and they didn't have those records. But 3 of the officers under the leader, when we were leaving, said, "Do you have any plans for dinner? Do you have any plans for dinner?" See, that's where you need to know the culture. You need to approach the culture in a humble way. Many people would go to that base and not come out because some of the Brazilians who were with us were faking, because this was just after the junta in Brazil was no longer in power. Okay, had returned to civilian power, but that base had a pretty bad reputation during the junta. So yes, we did go to someone's villa for dinner, and they showed us photographs. Now, why they did that? Well, first, this was several years after it had happened, but they wanted to try to understand. They still didn't understand what they had seen, and there were at different times between 20 and 40 or 50 people on those islands, military people, with small telescopes, with cameras and so on. The other thing is Brazil has a common border with France. Now, when I say that, people say, you're crazy. I mean, look at the map. You've got this big ocean in between. Well, that's not true, because French Guiana is a French département. It very much belongs to France. That's where, the base at Kourou, the rocket base, is. is the best if you want to really launch a difficult satellite. You launch it from the equator. You don't launch it from Cape Canaveral. At Kourou, you're just a few degrees from the equator, so you can do anything you want. So they have a French base. They launch Italian rockets, and for a while they were launching Soyuz from Kourou. Okay, so there is communication with Brazil on a number of subjects, and the Brazilians thought that the American Air Force was not telling them everything they were doing, including everything they were doing in Brazil. So they knew that France was, fairly sophisticated in the study of UFOs, and they wanted to. They knew I was, a participant in the French research. So they wanted to establish better relationships between the two countries, independent of the good relationships they had with the United States. So, you discover all those layers when you take the time to go there, to speak their language, to learn with them, not to come with pre-existing. You don't try to buy their data. You just don't do that. Then if they like you, they'll give you the data, I'll give you more. Okay. I had the same experience in Russia, where there were some American reporters who knew that the Russians had pictures of UFOs and so on in the days of Voronezh, the big observation at Voronezh. And they were trying to buy things, and it was, of course, the Russians are going to sell you something. We made it clear that we didn't buy any pictures, and we were given the stuff, including photographs that I've published since then of little lights, moving around. There was a picture of a group of people, and there is a little light moving in the middle of a group. Now, I've published that. It's in one of them. So people now are saying, well, we wonder if those little lights are real and so on. Well, they've been there for 50 years, and people just don't look. Now, we're in a culture there, as you know, you want to know what's the latest. Don't tell me about something that happened in France, 5 years ago, because that's old news. And people probably know everything about that. That's not true. Okay. I like to go back to the old cases. As you know, I've gone back to very old cases, century-old cases. And because we have a matrix, we have ways of analyzing things that people back then didn't have. So we're not going to ask the same questions. And to some extent, even if the people are dead, there are indices, there are things that we can reconstruct with our technology and with what we know now. So
fascinating. Now, over the years, you've collected various samples from, UFO cases, and many of them you've had analysed, some with Gary Nolan. So which of these samples would you consider to be the most anomalous to this day?
If you were a chemist, I would say, if I give you something out of a flying saucer, would you expect it to be just lead with copper, or with what kind of fancy propellant is that, And people talk about, special metamaterials and so on. What we have isn't metamaterials. We know about metamaterials. We make them in industry for special things, these glasses are made of metamaterials because I can bend it and it won't break and so on. I mean, those are, we've altered the materials. But so far, most of what I've seen from, UFO residues that are believable are complex mixtures of elements that we understand, that we know, that we can separate, we can analyze them. So we've looked at the isotopes, as you know, which means that somebody can fool me with copper and aluminum, but they cannot fool, Dr. Nolan and his lab when I bring him the sample, if we look at the isotopes. So so far, all the isotopes that we've tested were normal. And people get excited because they may differ by 3%, from the standard. But nature does that, okay? So it doesn't mean it comes from Mars. It doesn't mean it comes from... In fact, you would expect to have the same isotopes from something from Mars or something from Alpha Centauri, for that matter, because all those atoms were made at the same time. When the universe was built, or certainly maybe not the whole universe, but certainly our galaxy, was formed. So if you go to Alpha Centauri, you should expect to find iron, with pretty much the same, the same components, the same isotopes inside. So the question is the combinations of the isotopes. If you found iron or lead that had a radically different proportion, that would mean that somebody had modified it for a purpose. Now, you can buy things like that for a hospital, for example, for tracing, a certain disease, cancer, or so on. You can buy a few milligrams of something that has been modified at the isotope level. We know how to do that. We've done that since the first atom bomb. Separation of isotopes is how you make an atom bomb. That's fairly sophisticated. So we know how to do that. It's very, very expensive, as a number of countries are finding out now, in the Middle East. So, but we're talking about fairly large amounts of material that we find, that we've collected, from UFO sites. And there is no real pattern that we found. There are a couple that are exceptional by their structure, where we see the structure, we understand it, but we wouldn't know, or we wouldn't have the devices to create the energy to form that same structure. Okay, so somebody has found a way to do that. The question is, what else can they do, and is it related to the UFO problem?
Thank you.
We have a lot to do with that.
Now, a lot of times, especially recently, we're talking about legacy UFO programs, crash retrieval and reverse engineering programs. So my question with that is, throughout your years of work, have you ever come into contact with anybody that's worked in these legacy programs?
Anybody who was part of a team that did retrievals? Yes. I could not necessarily vouch for the information because I wasn't there. I think the people who are coming out now with, that kind of information, number one, have a lot of guts. I admire their courage. and they are trying their best not to break the law. I mean, they still want to stay within, because they may know about this particular object, but they don't know about what else it means. So if I found one, I wouldn't rush to a TV station saying, "Look what I found." Um, Number one, I wouldn't be allowed to do that because under security clearance, even though I don't have the clearance anymore, but I would be bound to first go. There have been occasions where I've done that, gone to my former security officer saying, "Look, I don't have the clearance anymore, but this came to my attention, and is it part of something classified, or can I talk about it?" Okay, I would always do that, and the people who are coming out now are in the same position. It's not an easy position, and they don't know what else this is part of, and so I admire their courage, and they may not have the answer, about what. On the other hand, look at the Trinity case. I published a book called Trinity that talks about three cases. Two of them are official military cases, one from France, one from the US. Socorro and Valençol, for which there is new information in my book, okay, that has never been published before, official information. Socorro was studied by 5 different agencies of the US government, okay? This was not, a bunch of amateurs, although the amateurs have done very well, in reconstructing things, including Socorro. But those are official files, and all of them say unidentified. After days, weeks, months, years of study going back and again. The same thing at Valençol. I've been on the site at Socorro. As you know, I was working with Dr. Heineck at the time. And we worked together in reconstructing the thing. I wasn't on site. I've gone back since then. At Valençol, I've gone twice for several days to talk to the witnesses. Okay, officially, they know about one witness. There are other witnesses. Okay, but this is a cultural question. This is the Midi, the south of France. This is not the north of France, and there are things that you tell the gendarmes, and there are things you don't tell the gendarmes. Okay? And that's okay. Okay, the gendarmes know that. Okay? And there were powerful TV people who wanted to come interview the main witness, Monsieur Mas, and he said no, he wanted nothing to do with people from Paris to begin with, and with TV. He didn't want to be, exhibited on TV as a weird guy who's seen, creatures in the UFO. In all three cases, in Socorro and in Valençol and in the other site in New Mexico, the beings are the same. The object is the same. It's an oval. Okay? People are talking about, those things are egg-shaped. Well, 1945, 45, at Trinity, the thing was an oval the size of the room where I am now. I mean, something like 12 meters. And same thing at Socorro. When all the illustrations in the books that mention Socorro show a disc, a crashed disc. Well, it never crashed, and it wasn't a disc. And that's what people are reading, okay? So in my book, with Paola Harris, we reconstructed everything. Paola had worked on it for 4 years, you know, at Trinity, and had interviewed the different witnesses already when I came in. One of them had died, but fortunately, um, you know, the main witness is still alive now. Again, he was a kid at the time. So those since then, the book has been questioned, which is fair. If you publish something, people have a right to say you're wrong. That's fair. So we went back and we found more witnesses, and we worked again on the case. And now we're sure that 1945 Trinity happened. And those kids watched the recovery for 10 days. Day after day after day. They were there. They had a reason to be on that ranch, and the ranch belonged, to their family. All the adults were still in Europe or scattered somewhere. And they watched the entire recovery. They measured the craft when the soldiers were gone. They actually measured the craft. One of them, Jose, who's still alive, went inside. Okay. So we know his father had gone inside, but they with a police officer, a New Mexico police officer, but the kid went inside by himself when the object was under a tarp, and the soldiers were gone temporarily. So, now, what more do you want to know? Well, you want to know the propulsion system? It didn't have any, except that we know I interrogated Jose at length, and that's again in our book. And I asked him about the floor. He said the floor was flat. Was there an opening in the floor? No, there was no opening in the floor. Well, it's an egg. And the floor was at maybe, 2/3 open and 1/3 closed, So you would have had a space, like the space of my desk here, maybe 6-7 feet by 2.5 feet, that was empty underneath the floor. If there is a propulsion system, it's in there. There is no opening. There are no propellers. There are no reactors. There is nothing. There is no opening at all. And that object had plowed a runway down the hill, for something like half a mile, before it. And it was scratched, but it wasn't destroyed. So if there is, so good luck. Now they are talking about having recovered egg-shaped object. It's big news. It's the news this afternoon. Well, 1945, we had all of that. The kids were there 10 days. Other people have looked at it. The policeman went inside. The New Mexico patrolman went inside with the father, not the 9-year-old kid, the father. Went inside. The kid took them to the place. So some of those things are fascinating. This isn't classified. Maybe they classified it since then. But I don't care. I mean, that's not my problem. I have witnesses who saw that, who went inside. Well, I have a perfect right to talk to them and to publish what they saw. But we're in a culture. Let me tell you one anecdote. There was an officer in charge of Blue Book for a while, the one that Dr. Hynek had the most high regard for. He didn't have a high regard for some of the others who were just reading the newspaper. Uh, but Colonel Friend was a black officer who had been in charge of Blue Book for a couple of years. Dr. Hynek had a lot of respect for him, and uh, went back and spoke to him occasionally when looking at old cases. And there had been a statement by the Air Force, one of the Air Force statements saying, oh, yes, we're studying this and so on, and it's this and that, very much like what you hear today from Congress. And Hynek asked Colonel Friend, what, you're a colonel, you're inside, what does that statement mean? And Colonel Friend is actually, we've got that on film, said it means one of two things. It means either that they know what it is or they don't know what it is. And, this summarizes so much. Everybody's saying we want disclosure. When are we going to have disclosure? Look at all the evidence we have, look at Vallee's book, look at all this stuff. Well, the secrecy could mean two things. It could mean that it's secret because they don't have any idea of what it is, or they have some ideas and they're hoping you're going to bring them more. That's all there is to it. We're still stuck at that stage. And we've been stuck at that stage for 60 years. Isn't it time to, open the doors and the windows and get out and get some scientists excited?
I hope so. I hope it happens soon. Now, Jacques, I need to ask you because you worked with NIDS as well under Robert Bigelow, and I just wondered if you could tell me what you think has been going on at Skinwalker Ranch.
I've gone to Skinwalker Ranch twice. First, when we were setting up the perimeter, under NIDS, not under BAS, and another time to look at detecting systems and so on, and to talk about to talk to some of the neighbors also in gathering the information they had. The information is not restricted to the ranch. I have not gone back under BAS. There was a team there. The procedure was different. Several of us have no interest in going back to the ranch. I respect the people who are there. I think they're doing a great job, bringing new instruments and doing all that. But we did do work year after year after year with the people on the ranch, bringing them to Las Vegas to talk to them. We looked at the medical aspects. We looked at all of that. I want to say it's a unique place. It's not a unique place. I was invited by Dr. Salisbury to reinvestigate all the cases he had investigated for his book 20 years before. So I went back to Utah in twice, a week each time. And we traveled throughout the northern half of Utah talking to the people we had interviewed before. All of them had stories about people appearing and disappearing. They had stories about the Skinwalker. I spoke to in five cases, to witnesses who were recent witnesses of the Skinwalker outside the ranch. We did not go back to the ranch. The ranch was guarded, and I told Dr. Salisbury we had no reason to go back. But the rest of Utah is a ranch. It has all of that, and it was fascinating because Dr. Salisbury was a Mormon bishop, so he had access to a lot of the community in casual conversations. We were invited everywhere. We had meals with the families everywhere. And he was also had established a great rapport with the Indian communities there, several Indian communities in that space. So we had access to the culture, not just to the place or to the statement. And those are two communities that don't talk very much outside. So you come from the outside, you can have all the instruments you want. You're not necessarily going to get the private things that have impacted the family, impacted the cattle. That there is one case we looked at. There was a case of a skinwalker about 30 miles north of the Bigelow Ranch. The people in that little village, had seen at dusk a skinwalker walking down the road, just walking north. They didn't interfere with it. They are scared, but the thing wasn't attacking anybody. But they called the highway patrol. Highway patrol gets there with a car, follows the creature. The creature starts running. They can run very fast. Yet no reason to, stop it or shoot it or interfere with it. It just follows it, see where it's going to go. They get into a reservation. So he calls the Indian police. The Indian police sends a car behind a highway patrol car. The guy gets on the radio and he calls the highway patrol guy and he says, "It's all yours, buddy." And he turns around and goes home because the Indians won't touch it. And we had those conversations with witnesses who were both Indian witnesses and non-Indian Mormons versus non-Mormon and so on. So you had those different nuances of how things were perceived. And again, Dr. Salisbury was an extraordinary. He was very, very friendly. He knew the area very well. Had been a Mormon bishop for a while. Was a university professor working with NASA on experiments on the shuttle. Okay, so there were all those things were together. This was fascinating to me. It was more fascinating than the Bigelow Ranch. We had half of Utah as our ranch with the same things, with people being paralyzed, with animals that were very strange coming by, with the cattle moving away, not interfering with it, with the dogs moving away. We had all of that for, again, 2 trips of 1 week each time. So this was, I never wrote it up, but this was very rich experience. It's real. It's very complex. It means we're not the only tenants in this building. There are other things going on, and we need to respect them. I think I would take a clue from the Indians.
Yes. No, of course. Thank you. Now, how have your views on UFOs evolved from the extraterrestrial hypothesis to the interdimensional or control system theory?
Well, I was trained in astronomy. I was excited about the space program. My first job was at Paris Observatory tracking satellites. We were the first scientists in France who were actually working with the space program and satellites and so on. So, it would be foolish to say that there isn't another civilization somewhere. In fact, you would expect we would be about average. There are some that are a lot dumber than we are, which is hard to believe, but there are some that are a lot brighter than we are. All the way to, the mystical stage. The, the problem isn't there. The the problem is what can we actually do with it? What can we bring as scientists? So at first I was trying to look at this as an instance of something from space coming here. I mean, we're going to go there sooner or later. We already went to the moon. We've sent a lot of stuff around that's flying through the universe now, and that people could pick up. So, but they could clearly come here. So the question now is, does that explain what people are telling us? And when I started going into the field and speaking to people, I found out that that's not what they are, describing. They're not describing. Some of them describe something that comes from the sky. It lands, it leaves traces. I can look at the traces, and then it flew off. Okay, so yeah, you could say this came from outer space. Fine, but there are also cases where something manifests inside a house. My wife had that experience, at a place we had in the forest, and I tell the story in the book. For a long time, I didn't know what to think of it. I didn't see it. I was asleep. It didn't last very long. There were lights moving around, small lights, like inspecting my library. Well, I have an interesting library, but what is the light doing there? Okay. I was sleeping. That woke her up. There were other cases like that I mentioned in the book. As you know, I had seen a UFO myself when I was a kid, when I was 14. So the ET idea doesn't really explain it. In the book, in the Trinity book, 3 cases, 2, 4, 7 creatures. The 7 creatures are humanoid. They are the size of the kids, they are about 3 feet, 3.5 feet tall. They have 2 eyes. They have a fairly large head with respect to their shoulders, but they have 2 arms and 2 legs. They look a little bit like an insect. That's why the kids couldn't just volunteer to go and help. That's what they wanted to do first. There's been an accident. We need to help the people. Well, it wasn't people, but they were breathing air. They didn't have a mask on their, like a pilot, or certainly like you would, like an astronaut on the moon. They were breathing air. You could see the communication in their eyes. They could see they were scared. In Socorro, Lonnie Zamora could tell that something about what the 2 creatures were thinking about him. I mean, there was there was a deep contact in that sense, even though there was no overt communication. But they went back inside and it took off. The same thing in Valençol. There was communication in Valençol. There was deep communication in Valençol. The witness was a businessman, and a very sophisticated member of the community. And there is no question there was a deep communication there. And he didn't talk about that to the gendarmes because he wanted, it's not that he wanted to hide it. He thought that this would develop into something. And if it had happened once, it might happen again. And and maybe it did. Okay, so the all that area, there were three of us who were sworn to secrecy about what happened after that. But that's not part of the investigation by the French government. And because he felt it was a nucleus of something that would continue to develop. And I'm going to respect it.
Yeah. So do you still more subscribe to this interdimensional hypothesis nowadays?
So there is, again, I go knowing all that, knowing things can go through the wall, so on. I want to listen very carefully to the witnesses. I don't want to approach it as approaching a spacecraft. It's not a spacecraft. It does, well, first, my friend Eric, who is a physicist, tells me that, Eric Davis, that there is no space and there is no time. Those are things that our brain makes up to explain what we experience every day. But that's not, in physics, you don't need that. You need something much more profound, at the quantum level, whatever. That's what you use to, and then we translate it into space and time because that's what it's convenient to measure that, One, when I published one of my early books in the 70s, a big publisher in New York who sent me to different colleges, to give lectures. Universities were really interested in all that, to expose the kids to new things that were questions, mysteries. And I went to one college, which was a special girls' college on the East Coast in those days. Now it's mixed. And the one of the students had organized a lecture and drove me back to the airport. She calls me about 4 years ago, out of nowhere. She's now the CEO of a communication company that works overseas. She told me, look, I never forgot your lecture. Again, it's a long time ago. I never forgot your lecture and something happened. And I'd like to know, if you're going to be in Washington anytime soon. And I said, well, I go there maybe twice a year. She said, next time, when you're ready to go back to Dallas, call me. I'll pick you up at your hotel. I'll drive you to the airport and I'll tell you what I saw. So I said, fine. And she did. We got into her Mercedes and, you pass the woods on both sides of the freeway. It's very nicely done. It's a beautiful freeway. It hides the CIA and all the other government buildings, and she slows down on the right lane, and she says, "This is dusk now. This is about 6 o'clock in the evening. The sky is still lit." She says, "You see those trees? I was driving to the airport to catch a flight. And I saw something flying there. Again, very large, twice the size of an airline, with what looked like windows with lights. Okay? I don't know what it was, but it looked like lights that could have been windows. And it was flying slowly, minding its own business, no clouds. And as it became fuzzy, It kept going, not faster, not slower. The lights became, a little bit more, you know, uh, dark and so on. And then it just disappeared. It was still moving. It made no noise. It was over the Washington airport. It wasn't being intercepted. Maybe it wasn't on any radar. And it disappeared out of the universe. Okay? That's what, if you went into another dimension slowly, you could do that. I mean, there is no reason to, to vanish in a flash or anything like that. You could just go through, make your own doorway, and punch your hole in for space, in our four-dimensional universe, and go into another four-dimensional universe or into a 15-dimensional universe. Now, when I talk to physicists, they say, yeah, that could happen. Uh, we don't have examples of that. We cannot do that in the lab. We cannot do that in the atmosphere, but we have equations for that. It's just another, you have to forget about. One time, uh, I said, well, can I, uh, talk to my colleagues about that? Would you be willing to meet with them? She said, I'm a CEO of a business. CEOs, need to run the business. We're not supposed to see things like that. I've had, Silicon Valley is full of people. As a venture capitalist, I know, I know something about the finances of those companies. I work with the companies if I'm an investor in the company and so on. So they will tell me those stories, but again, this is not being reported. And these are people who are very often are high tech, leaders of significant companies that are on the New York Stock Exchange, and they've seen UFOs over their property with their families. They want me to know because they respect the research that is being done. They want to contribute to the research, but they're not going to be on TV. Okay? And that's the reality.
That's so interesting. Well, listen, Jacques, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute honor to speak with you.
Thank you. Thanks for your questions.